I'll never forget that night. It's been years, but the memory still haunts me like it was just yesterday. I'm not a person who easily gets scared, especially being a long-haul trucker. We spend a lot of time on the road, covering miles of nothing but highways, dark forests, and abandoned rest stops. But that night, something happened that changed me forever. I was driving along Route 66, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The moon was barely a sliver, and the darkness felt like it was swallowing everything around me. The air inside the truck's cab was heavy, thick with the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I was coming up on a little town, or at least that's what the map showed, and I needed a break. My eyes were starting to droop, and the last thing I wanted was to fall asleep at the wheel. So I pulled off the main road into what looked like a deserted rest stop. The place was run down, the lights flickered, and the buildings were falling apart like they hadn't seen a coat of paint in years. A single old lamp cast a faint yellow light over the cracked pavement. There were no other trucks or cars around, which should have been a red flag, but I didn't care. I was exhausted and just wanted to rest for a bit. I parked the truck by the dilapidated building and stretched, stepping out into the cool night air. The quiet was almost unnatural. Not a single animal made a sound, not even the wind. It was just still. I walked toward the restroom, my boots scraping against the gravel, and that's when I heard something strange. A soft, almost inaudible sound, like a voice. It was coming from behind the restroom building. I froze. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. It sounded like someone was whispering my name. Jake. I whipped around, looking behind me. There was nothing but darkness, the kind of darkness you can't see through. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a few cautious steps forward, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no sign of anyone. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as I walked past the building toward the restroom, the whisper came again. Jake. It was closer now, and this time, it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, but once again, I saw nothing. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment I thought about getting back in the truck and driving off, but my legs felt like lead. I was rooted to the spot. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. The restroom was only a few feet away, but every step felt like I was walking through thick mud. The whisper stopped. I didn't hear it again until I was inside the restroom, standing at the sink, Spirit trying to splash some water on my face. Jake. It was unmistakable now. The voice was in my head, a soft, rasping whisper. It sounded desperate, like someone was pleading with me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I looked around the restroom, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But again, there was nothing. The bathroom was empty. I don't know what came over me, but I felt like I had to leave. I grabbed my keys and ran out of there like my life depended on it. The second I stepped outside, the air felt colder, the silence even more oppressive. I couldn't see anything. The entire rest stop seemed to close in on me, like the buildings and trees were leaning in, watching me. I made it back to my truck, but as I reached for the door handle, I heard something behind me. It wasn't a whisper anymore, but a full-on voice echoing through the still night. Get in the truck, Jake, get in the truck. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but again, nothing. Just the eerie darkness of the rest stop. But that voice, it was real. It was coming from inside my head, as if it were a part of me. I could feel it wrapping around me, tightening like a noose. The urge to run, to drive as far away from that place as I could, surged through me. I slammed the door shut and started the truck. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, driving faster than I ever had before. But as I pulled away from the rest stop, I felt something shift. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I wasn't alone in the cab anymore. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see the empty road behind me. But what I saw, I'll never forget. There was a shadow in the back of the truck, standing perfectly still, like it was watching me. My heart stopped. I couldn't make out any details, just the dark silhouette of a figure. It wasn't human. It was too tall, too thin, with long arms that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. I couldn't tear my gaze away, and the air inside the truck grew thick, like I was suffocating. Jake, Why did you leave? The voice echoed in the cab, and I could feel it vibrating in my skull. It wasn't the same voice as before. This one was deep, guttural, like something from the very depths of hell. I slammed on the brakes, almost losing control of the truck. My hands were shaking, my mind racing, but I knew I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay there, not with whatever that thing was in the back of my truck. I floored the accelerator again, speeding down the highway, but the shadow in the mirror didn't disappear. It stayed with me, always there, just out of reach. The temperature inside the cab dropped, and I could see my breath coming out in misty clouds. I tried to blink the image away, but it was no use. That thing was there, and it was following me. I tried everything to shake it off. I switched lanes, took sharp turns, and even pulled over to the side of the road a couple of times to get out and check the truck. But each time I looked in the rearview mirror, the shadow was still there, always in the same spot. I don't know how long I drove like that. Time felt like it was bending, stretching, like I was trapped in a nightmare. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. My eyes were burning from exhaustion, and I was starting to lose track of the road. I had to stop. I pulled over again, this time on a deserted stretch of highway. I threw the truck into park, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the cold night air. The shadow was gone. At least it seemed to be. There was nothing in the mirror anymore. But as I walked around the truck, checking the cargo, I heard the whisper one last time. Jake. It was coming from inside the truck, and I knew then that I would never be free. It would always follow me, always haunt me. I didn't know what I had encountered that night, but I knew one thing for sure. Some things are better left undisturbed, and that rest stop, that voice, whatever it was, had been waiting for someone like me. I got back in the truck, started it up, and drove away, never looking back. But the terror, the feeling of that thing in the shadows, never left me. I don't know what it wanted from me or why it chose me, but I can tell you this: if you ever find yourself on a quiet stretch of highway with nothing but darkness around you, don't stop at those deserted rest stops. Don't listen to the whispers, because there's something out there, something that will never let you leave.
Next story.
I've been a trucker for almost 2 decades. You'd think that after all those years on the road, I'd be used to the strange things that happen. The late night stops, the weird people, and the miles of empty highway that stretch on forever. But let me tell you, there are things out there, things that can't be explained, things that make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. I learned that the hard way one night, on a stretch of road so desolate, it felt like the end of the world. It was a late autumn evening, the kind where the sun had long disappeared and the darkness seemed to hang heavier than usual. I had just dropped off a load in Kentucky and was heading down Route 66 to make my way to Texas. The truck was humming along fine, and I was lost in my thoughts, the road ahead illuminated only by the dim headlights. The air was chilly, and there was an eerie silence outside, the kind that feels unnatural. There were no other trucks, no cars, just me and the endless roads stretching on. It was like I was the only person left in the world. About 3 hours in, as I was cruising through a particularly lonely stretch of highway, I saw something strange in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the headlights, but as I got closer, I could make out a figure. It was standing right there on the shoulder of the road. A woman. She was dressed in a tattered white dress, the kind you only see in horror movies. Her hair was disheveled, hanging in front of her face. I slowed down, my gut telling me something wasn't right. I've picked up hitchhikers before. Hell, I've even helped a few people stranded on the side of the road. But something about her felt different. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring straight ahead, like she wasn't even aware of the passing vehicles. The closer I got, the more my instincts screamed at me to keep going, to not stop. But I didn't listen. I pulled over and rolled down the window, my hand gripping the wheel tightly. "Hey there, you need a ride?" I called out, my voice a little shakier than I wanted it to sound. She didn't answer. She just kept staring straight ahead, unmoving. I leaned out a little more, trying to get her attention. "Ma'am? You okay?" Finally, she turned her head. But it wasn't just a simple turn. It was slow. Too slow. And when she looked at me, her eyes weren't what I expected. They were completely black. No white, no iris, just inky darkness. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine and my stomach churned. "Get in the truck," I said, more out of fear than kindness, but she didn't move. Instead, she started to slowly walk toward the front of my truck, dragging her feet like she was in a trance. That's when I noticed something that made my heart stop. She was barefoot. Her feet were covered in dirt, and they left dark, wet prints on the asphalt with each step. The longer she walked, the more I could feel something heavy in the air, something suffocating. I quickly rolled up the window and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. I didn't look back, but I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I told myself it was just some crazy woman out there, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something I couldn't understand. As I drove on, the silence in the truck grew unbearable. The hum of the engine seemed to fade, and all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. The road seemed longer, the darkness seemed deeper, and the air colder. I kept checking my mirrors, but there was nothing. No headlights behind me. No sign of the woman. Maybe she was just a figment of my imagination, I tried to convince myself. But that didn't explain the feeling of dread that had settled in my bones. Hours passed, and I found myself in a stretch of road I didn't recognize. I had been on this route countless times, but this part of the highway felt wrong. The trees were sparse and the road was winding, almost like it was leading me into nowhere. That's when I saw something else. A truck. It was pulled over on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly. It was an old rig, rusted and beaten up. I slowed down, wondering if someone needed help, but as I passed, I noticed something chilling. There was no driver. I don't know how, but I just knew that truck hadn't been there before. It hadn't been on the side of the road when I passed by earlier. I slammed on the brakes, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror, but when I looked back at the truck, it was gone. Just like that. Vanished into thin air. I don't know if I was seeing things, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I hit the gas again, my foot never lifting from the pedal as I sped through that lonely stretch of road. The lights from the truck ahead seemed to blur into the darkness, and I swore I could hear something. A sound. It was faint at first, but as I pressed on, it grew louder. It sounded like whispers. The kind of whispers you hear in your ear when you're alone in a dark room. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind, but the whispers kept getting closer. Louder. It was like they were coming from the back of the truck, from the sleeper cab. I dared a glance in the mirror, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. Nothing, just the emptiness of the road. I wiped my brow, trying to steady my nerves. I wasn't going crazy. I had to be imagining it. But as I drove on, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was in the truck with me. And then, in the middle of nowhere, it happened. The engine sputtered, the lights flickered, and the truck stopped. Just stopped, dead in the middle of the highway. I tried the ignition, but it wouldn't start. I was stuck, completely alone in the pitch-black darkness. The only sound was the hum of the wind against the truck and that damn whispering. It was inside my head now, echoing in the silence. I felt my pulse quicken as the air grew colder and the whispers began to take shape. They were calling my name. Soft at first, then louder and more frantic. Come back! Come back! My heart was racing as I reached for the door handle. I knew I had to get out of there. But before I could open the door, I heard something behind me. A soft tap, then another and another. It was coming from the sleeper cab. I spun around, my breath shallow, and I saw it. The woman. She was standing in the doorway of the cab, her face hidden behind that tangled mass of hair. Her eyes were still black as night. She took a step forward, and I could see that her dress was now stained with something dark, something wet. She didn't speak. She just stood there, watching me. I don't know how I moved, but I bolted out of the truck, running as fast as I could into the dark. I didn't look back. I didn't care about anything but getting away from her. From whatever it was that had been following me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found a gas station. A little shack with a flickering light outside. The man behind the counter gave me a strange look as I stumbled in, drenched in sweat, my heart still pounding. "What's wrong with you, boy?" he asked. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. All I could do was stare at him, my mind still racing with what I had seen. That woman. That truck. The whispers. After a while, the man spoke again, his voice low. You saw her, didn't you? I froze. Who? The ghost. The one that haunts this road. She's been there for years. People say she was a hitchhiker who died in an accident, but some of us think she's been looking for something, or someone. And if you stop, well, you might never leave. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't need to. I grabbed my bag, got back in the truck, and drove the hell out of there. I haven't been on that stretch of road since, and I never will.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. Hell, I've been driving trucks for over 15 years, crossing state lines from dawn till dusk, through rain, snow, and every godforsaken highway you could think of. But what happened that night, I still can't explain. It started like any other night. I was hauling a load of produce up I-40, just past the Arizona border. It was a quiet, uneventful drive with only the hum of the engine keeping me company. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the empty stretch of highway. No other trucks, no cars, just me and the road. I'd been on the road for nearly 10 hours, and the fatigue was starting to set in. I've driven long hours before, but tonight something felt off. Maybe it was the stillness. The air felt thick, and the wind had a strange kind of quiet to it. It was as though the world had just stopped. That's when I saw her. At first, it was just a flash in my rearview mirror. A figure standing by the side of the road in the dark, dressed in what looked like a white dress. No car, no truck, no nothing. Just this woman. I blinked, and she was gone. I figured it was my tired eyes playing tricks on me. You get used to that kind of stuff after so many nights on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept driving, my fingers tight on the wheel, trying to push the thoughts of the figure out of my mind. But a few miles down the road, I saw her again. This time, she was standing in the middle of the highway. Her hair was long, wild, and her skin pale as a ghost. I slammed on the brakes, swerving to avoid her, but when I looked in the rearview mirror again, nothing. No sign of her. The road was empty, just like before. At this point, I was starting to get nervous. My heart was racing, and the sweat was starting to bead on my forehead. It's not uncommon to see things on the road, mirages, fatigue-induced hallucinations, maybe even a few desert critters running across. But this felt different. This wasn't the kind of thing you just shrug off. There was something about the way she stood there, motionless, that made my blood run cold. I decided I'd pull over and get some coffee at the next rest stop, clear my head. As I approached the rest area, the headlights of my rig flickered for a second. It was a weird electrical glitch, but when I turned the corner into the lot, I saw her again. The woman in the white dress standing by the vending machines. I parked my truck, but I didn't get out right away. I sat there for a minute, staring at her. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring off into the distance. I could see the outline of her figure in the dim light, but I couldn't make out her face. There was something unnerving about the way she was just standing there, waiting. I told myself it was probably just some prank, a hitchhiker, or someone playing games. But when I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the vending machines, she didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge me. It was like she didn't even know I was there. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to leave. I got back into the truck, and just as I was about to pull away, I saw her again, standing at the edge of the lot, watching me. Her head tilted slightly, as though she was studying me. I hit the gas and pulled back onto the highway, heart pounding in my chest. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the tiredness was getting to me, or maybe the desert heat was playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I drove for what seemed like hours, the road stretching endlessly in front of me, and still I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something moving in the distance. The white dress, the pale figure, she was following me. Then came the sound. At first I thought it was just the hum of the engine or the wind, but then faintly I heard a whisper. It was so soft I almost didn't hear it over the noise of the truck, but it was there, just on the edge of my hearing. A voice. A woman's voice. "Help me." I froze, my hands tightening on the wheel. The voice was so clear, so close. It was like she was right there beside me. My heart started pounding and I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. I was shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. I looked around, but there was nothing. No woman in the white dress, no figure in the distance. But the voice, it lingered in my head. Help me. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, and my instincts were screaming at me to get back in the truck and drive, but something held me there. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't just leave, not after everything that had happened. I opened the door and stepped out, the night air biting at my skin. The road was silent, the only sound the rustle of the wind. And that's when I saw it, the figure standing just ahead in the middle of the highway. She was closer now, her face just barely visible in the darkness. Her skin was deathly pale and her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I took a step forward, but as I did, I heard a sound from behind me. A low, guttural growl, like an animal in pain. I spun around, but nothing was there. The growl echoed in the air again, this time louder, closer. It wasn't a coyote or some wild animal. This was something different, something darker. I turned back to face the woman, and that's when I saw it. Her eyes. They were hollow, black pits, nothing inside. She was staring right at me, and her mouth stretched into a twisted grin, showing teeth that were too sharp, too long. The growl came again, louder, closer, and I could feel the ground beneath my feet tremble. I don't remember getting back to my truck. All I know is that I ran. I jumped in, slammed the door, and hit the gas like my life depended on it. The truck roared to life, tires screeching as I tore down the highway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I could feel her presence, like a shadow on my tail, following me no matter how fast I drove. I drove until the sun began to rise, the first light of day breaking through the darkness. I pulled into a rest stop, shaking and exhausted, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? A trucker talking about ghosts? No one would ever take me seriously, but I know what I saw, and I know she's still out there, somewhere, waiting. Every time I hit the road now, I always check the rearview mirror, and sometimes when the night is quiet and the road stretches endlessly ahead, I swear I can hear her voice. Help me.
Next story.
It was late October, the air crisp with the cool bite of fall, when I took a job that I'll never forget. I'd been driving trucks for years, so the routine of long hauls had become second nature to me. But this trip was different. The route was unfamiliar, the cargo somewhat vague, and the delivery time was unusually tight. But it paid well, so I took it. The client, someone I'd never heard of before, was a shipping company located in a small, isolated town in the mountains. The man I spoke with on the phone, Mr. Holloway, had a low, gravelly voice that sent an odd chill through me. His instructions were clear. Get there by dawn, no stops, no detours. He gave me the address, and that was that. I left the city around 11 p.m. I figured if I kept a steady pace, I could make it there in time. The road to this town, though, wasn't like the highways I was used to. It wound through dense forests, the trees so thick that the light of my headlights barely reached the road ahead. A few hours into the trip, the chill in the air seemed to get colder, and the road turned more treacherous. Sharp curves, steep inclines, and sharp drops. I wasn't afraid, just cautious. But something about that place felt wrong. Around 3 a.m., the fog rolled in. Thick and dense, it blanketed the road ahead, the white mist swirling like smoke, making it almost impossible to see. The truck's engine hummed steadily, but it felt like the whole world had gone silent. No animals, no sounds of nature, just me and the fog. That's when I saw the first sign, an old road sign, barely visible in the mist, swinging on its post. It wasn't the sign I was looking for. The name of the town I was headed to wasn't anywhere on it, but what struck me was the image, 2 figures standing under a tree. It looked like a silhouette of a man and a woman, both with dark, hollow eyes, their hands stretched out toward the driver. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe it was a trick of the fog. But when I looked again, the figures on the sign seemed to be moving, ever so slightly, as though they were alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pressed on, trying to push the unsettling thought from my mind, but the air grew colder and the fog thicker. By the time I reached the fork in the road, I noticed the strange thing. There were no other vehicles, no lights, no signs of civilization for miles. I had been driving for hours and hadn't passed a single house, gas station, or even another truck. It was as if the world had swallowed me whole. I was just about to take the left turn toward the town when I saw something in the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fog, but as I slowed down, I could make out the figure of a person standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, heart pounding. I couldn't see the person clearly through the mist, but I could tell they were tall, unnaturally tall. I called out to them, asking if they needed help, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it started moving, slowly and deliberately, stepping toward my truck. I couldn't make out any details, no features, just a dark, looming shape. My heart raced. Something was wrong. I backed up a little, but the figure kept moving forward, slowly, until it was directly in front of my truck. That's when I noticed something even stranger. There was no road ahead of me. No pavement, no trees, just an endless expanse of fog. The road had disappeared, and the figure was blocking my way. I slammed my fist against the horn, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence overwhelming, like it was waiting for me to make a move. And then I heard it. A soft voice, like a whisper in the wind, but clear enough that I could hear it. Turn back. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. I froze, my hands clutching the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded in reality. I wanted to drive away, to turn around and leave, but something kept me there. My body wouldn't respond. I couldn't explain it, but the fog, the figure, the voice, they all seemed to be pulling me in, as if the world itself was pushing me towards some inevitable fate. Finally, after what felt like hours, the figure stepped aside. It didn't move quickly or violently. It just faded back into the mist, as if it had never been there. But the road in front of me was still gone. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere with no idea where to go next. I didn't know what to do. I should have turned around, gone back to the main road, but something deep in my gut told me that if I left now, I wouldn't make it out of the fog alive. So I took the turn, driving down the narrow, winding path toward the town. The mist followed me, thicker now, as if it were alive, closing in from all sides. I couldn't see the end of the road, couldn't see anything except for the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the fog. The further I drove, the more the atmosphere shifted. The fog seemed to thicken with each passing minute, until I could hardly make out the road at all. I turned a corner and suddenly, I saw it. The town. It was small, barely a dot on the map, but it stood in front of me like a forgotten ghost from another time. The buildings were old, the kind you'd see in a history book about dying towns. The streets were deserted, the windows dark, but what made my blood run cold was the sound. In the distance, I could hear something. Voices, whispers, like 1,000 people murmuring in the shadows. I parked the truck near the edge of town, and before I could even step out, I saw him. Mr. Halloway. He was standing at the end of the street, watching me. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and black like he hadn't blinked in years. His mouth stretched into a thin, eerie smile, but it wasn't friendly. It was knowing. "You made it," he said, his voice dry like dead leaves. I felt a chill run through my spine as he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Where am I?" "This is the place," he said, his smile widening. "This is where you were always meant to come. You've crossed over now, there's no turning back." I didn't understand. The world around me felt like it was closing in, suffocating me, and I wanted to run, to get out of there. But the air was thick with a pressure I couldn't escape. "Don't worry," Mr. Halloway said, as if reading my thoughts. "You'll get used to it. Everyone does. Eventually you'll see it too. The people here, the ones who never left, the ones who never could." And then, with that cold smile still lingering, he turned and disappeared into the fog. I don't know how long I stayed there, sitting in the truck, too afraid to move. I couldn't shake the feeling that the town wasn't real, that it was some kind of twisted illusion. But the worst part, I realized that I'm the first trucker to find this place, and I won't be the last.
Next story.
It was late, a crisp autumn night, and I was driving through the back roads of Kentucky on a solo run. I'd been out on the road for nearly 16 hours, and the exhaustion was catching up with me. You know the feeling. Your eyelids heavy, your mind drifting. The only thing keeping you awake is the engine's hum and the occasional jolt from the road. The sun had set a while ago, and all I could see were the narrow lines of my headlights slicing through the darkness, illuminating the occasional signpost or the silhouette of trees bending in the wind. The air smelled of dry leaves and cold earth. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just another night, just another long haul. I came across a small town, barely more than a cluster of houses and a few rundown businesses. The kind of place where the lights seem a little too dim and the streets seem too empty. My GPS told me to take a turn onto a side road that would shortcut me through to my next destination. I figured it would be better to take a shortcut than add another hour to my trip, so I turned off the main highway. That's when the weirdness started. The road was narrow, with barely enough space for my rig to fit, but I kept going. My headlights reflected off the thick fog that was beginning to roll in. I could barely see a few feet ahead. But I kept going, thinking that I could power through it, that this fog would clear in a minute or two. The more I drove, the thicker it got. I was beginning to feel uneasy when I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. I almost hit him. It was a man, tall, thin, with a dark coat that almost blended in with the fog. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but there was something about him that gave me a bad feeling. The moment I stopped, he didn't move, just stood there, like he was waiting for something. I rolled down the window cautiously, unsure what to do. "Hey, are you all right?" I asked, my voice sounding much more nervous than I wanted it to. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised his hand and pointed down the road, his finger stretching out toward the end of the fog. No words. No acknowledgement of my presence. Just that cold, silent gesture. I felt a chill in my spine. Every instinct told me to leave, to turn around and drive away. But something kept me there. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the isolation of the road or the strange pull in the air. But I didn't leave. I shifted the truck into gear, barely making out the road ahead. The fog was suffocating now. I could barely see 5 feet in front of me. I drove forward, my headlights casting an eerie glow on the walls of mist that seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. And then I heard it. A low, almost inaudible sound, like a growl. It came from behind me, somewhere in the fog. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but the fog was so thick I could barely make out anything. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I gripped the wheel harder. It was then that I noticed something else. The sound of footsteps. I looked back ahead and saw a flicker of movement in the fog. It was a shape coming toward me. It wasn't a person, though. It was too fast. Too unnatural. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew I had to get away. I floored the gas pedal, the truck jerking forward with a sudden acceleration. But no matter how fast I went, the figure seemed to stay right behind me, closer, closing the distance. I could feel it. Whatever it was gaining on me. I pushed the truck harder, my hands sweating as I gripped the wheel. But it didn't matter how fast I drove. The fog, thick as smoke, swallowed the road ahead. And that sound, those footsteps, kept getting louder, closer. In a panic, I swerved to the side of the road, hoping to lose whatever it was. I jumped out of the truck and looked around, breathless. But there was nothing. Just the swirling fog and the cold night air. The growling sound had stopped, and I couldn't see anything, hear anything. Then, just as I was about to climb back into the truck, I saw something. At the end of the road, standing in the shadows of the fog, was the man. The same man I had passed earlier, standing in the middle of the road. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, emerging from the mist, were others. Figures. Tall, faceless, their movements slow but deliberate. Their clothes were tattered, their hands stretched forward, as though beckoning me. And their eyes, if they even had eyes, burned with an unnatural light. I couldn't look away. I could feel them drawing me in, and my chest tightened in fear. I rushed back into the truck and slammed the door shut, heart pounding in my chest. My breath was shallow as I started the engine again. I didn't know if they were real or if it was some trick of the fog, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I slammed the truck into gear, spinning the tires as I pulled back onto the road, not daring to look behind me. The truck roared down the road, my hands shaking as I clutched the wheel. The fog was thinning now, and the figures, whatever they were, seemed to vanish as if they had never been there at all. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. My nerves were shot, and I didn't care about my delivery anymore. I just wanted out of there, wanted to be around people where it felt safe. I pulled into a gas station, parked the truck, and shut off the engine. I stayed there for a while, not daring to get out. When I finally mustered up the courage to step out of the truck, the chill of the night air hit me hard, but I was glad to be on solid ground, surrounded by people again. I went inside, trying to act normal, but the attendant looked at me with a puzzled expression. "You all right, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I shook my head, trying to brush it off, but I couldn't. I couldn't forget that feeling, that cold pull of something unnatural, and I couldn't stop hearing those footsteps. I've driven that road once or twice since then, but I've never taken that shortcut again, never even came close to it. And every time I drive at night through the fog, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures standing silently at the end of the road, waiting for me to come back.
Next story.
I've always been a practical guy. I've been a trucker for over 10 years now, and I've heard plenty of stories from my fellow drivers about ghost sightings and strange things happening on the road. Most of them are just exaggerations, or so I thought. That was until I had an experience of my own that made me question everything. It was late in the evening when I pulled into a small, dusty truck stop. The sign outside was faded, barely legible, but I didn't care. I was looking for a place to rest for the night, and this place seemed as good as any. The gas pumps were old, the lights flickering on and off, but there were a couple of trucks parked in front of the diner, so I figured it couldn't be completely deserted. I got out, stretched my legs, and walked into the diner. It was a typical small-town place, the kind you'd expect to see in old movies, with a long counter and a few booths along the walls. The smell of cheap coffee and greasy food hit me as soon as I walked in, and the sound of an old jukebox playing some forgotten country song filled the air. I slid into a booth near the window, took off my cap, and ordered a coffee. The waitress, a woman who looked like she'd been working here for decades, gave me a strange smile, like she knew something I didn't. She handed me the coffee without a word and walked off to tend to the other customers. I didn't think much of it, just another odd interaction with a truck stop worker, but something in the air felt off. It was that gut feeling you get when you know something isn't quite right. I pulled my phone out to check the route for the next leg of my trip. That's when I noticed it. There was a man sitting alone at the far end of the diner, just staring at me. He had a dark hat pulled low over his face, and his coat was worn like it had seen years of use. He didn't move, didn't even blink, just watched me like a hawk. I tried to ignore him, but it was hard not to feel his gaze burning into me. I kept glancing up from my phone, but every time I did, he was still there, not a muscle moving. Something about his stillness was unnatural, like he wasn't quite human. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, ready to leave the diner and get back on the road. But as I passed the man's table, he did something I wasn't expecting. He raised his hands slowly, his fingers barely twitching, and then he pointed at me. A chill ran down my spine. I froze for a second, my heart racing. There was no one else in the diner who seemed to notice what was happening. The waitress was still behind the counter, talking to another trucker, and the other patrons were too focused on their food to care. But I couldn't take my eyes off the man. There was something deeply wrong about the way he was looking at me. I walked out of the diner quickly, almost running to my truck. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me. I got into the cab, locked the door, and started the engine. I couldn't leave fast enough. I pulled out of the truck stop, heading back onto the highway. The road stretched ahead, lit only by the dim glow of my headlights. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept checking my mirrors, looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing behind me. No headlights, no other trucks, just the lonely stretch of road disappearing into the dark. I was about 15 miles down the road when I saw it. In my rearview mirror, a set of headlights appeared, growing brighter and closer. A truck, I thought. But then something caught my attention. The headlights weren't moving in the normal way. They were swaying, almost as if the truck was being driven erratically. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I slowed down, giving the truck space to pass me, but it didn't. The headlights stayed behind me, too close, never gaining ground or falling back. The feeling in my gut grew worse. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the road, hoping to let the truck pass. But it didn't. The headlights stopped behind me. I sat there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to convince myself that it was just another driver who had pulled over to take a break. But then through my rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The truck wasn't there anymore. The headlights were gone, but the shadow remained. A figure, standing tall on the side of the road, was staring at me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. My hand trembled on the steering wheel as I glanced over my shoulder, but the figure didn't move. It felt like an eternity before I finally started driving again. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my heart pounding in my chest. The road seemed endless, the darkness wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I drove for hours, not stopping, too afraid to look behind me, too terrified to slow down. It wasn't until I reached the next town that I finally stopped at a gas station. I got out, my hands shaking, my body exhausted from the fear and the adrenaline. I walked inside to pay for the fuel, and the cashier, a young guy with a baseball cap, gave me a strange look. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I didn't know how to answer. I hadn't told anyone what happened yet, hadn't even fully processed it myself. But something in the cashier's expression made me ask the question I'd been avoiding. "Has anyone else ever reported seeing something on this stretch of road?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The young man froze, his eyes widening slightly. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. "Yeah, a few folks have mentioned something about it," he said, his voice low. "The locals say there's a ghost that haunts this stretch. A trucker, they say. He died years ago in a crash right on that road. They say he still follows drivers, keeps them from leaving." I felt my blood run cold. The man in the diner. The figure by the side of the road. It all started to make sense. I've been driving these roads for years, but I've never felt the same since that night. I've passed that truck stop 100 times, and I still don't know what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure. Something out there is waiting for someone to stop. And once you do, it's hard to leave.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a routine haul, the kind of trip that any trucker would take without a second thought. I was headed across the Midwest, just another stretch of long highway between towns. A simple job. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as the sun started to dip below the horizon, the eerie silence that enveloped the road felt anything but ordinary. I was driving alone, my rig rumbling along the empty stretch of highway. There were no other trucks around, no cars in sight. Just me, the open road, and the darkening sky above. I had been on this road countless times before, and nothing had ever felt off, until tonight. Around 9 p.m., I noticed a strange fog creeping across the road. It wasn't like the usual mist you'd get near rivers or lakes. No, this fog was thick and unnatural, swallowing the headlights of my truck as I drove deeper into it. The air inside the cab grew colder, and my breath fogged up the window despite the heater running full blast. I slowed down, instinctively gripping the steering wheel tighter. The fog was so thick that it was hard to see even a few feet ahead. The rumble of my engine was the only sound I could hear. I glanced at the clock, almost 10 p.m. My eyes were growing heavy, fatigue setting in after hours on the road. That's when I saw it. In the distance through the fog, I noticed a shape on the side of the road. It was a figure standing completely still. It was a man, I thought at first, tall, dressed in dark clothing. But something about him felt wrong. His posture was unnaturally rigid, like he was frozen in place, not moving a muscle. I slowed down even more as I approached, wondering if I should stop and offer help. It was the kind of thing I'd done 100 times before, offering a ride to a stranded motorist or helping someone with car trouble. But as I got closer, something about the man's presence made me uneasy. I didn't know why, but a sense of dread filled me, urging me to keep driving. The figure didn't move. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for me. I passed him slowly, my eyes locked on him as I drove by. And then, as soon as I had passed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. A whisper. It wasn't a normal voice. It was a dry, rasping sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed in my head, and I could hear it as clearly as if it were right next to me. "Turn around." I froze. My hands gripped the steering wheel harder, my knuckles white. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man behind me, standing in the middle of the road. But there was nothing, just the thick fog and the endless stretch of highway. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the voice as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was tired, and the fog was messing with my senses. But then it came again, louder this time, and it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. Turn around. Now. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel my pulse in my ears, a heavy, relentless beat that drowned out all other sounds. I stared into the fog, unsure of what to do next. Should I turn around? Was this a prank? A hallucination? I glanced around, half expecting to see the man standing at the edge of the road again, but there was nothing. Nothing except for the oppressive fog and the feeling that someone was watching me. The voice came again, this time not in my head, but as a physical sound, emanating from the darkness ahead. It was clearer, almost like someone was standing right outside my truck. Turn around. My blood ran cold. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was going on, it wasn't right. I threw the truck into reverse, my eyes scanning the fog, searching for any sign of movement. The headlights barely pierced the thick mist, but I kept backing up, desperate to see what had been there. And then, just as I thought I was about to give up and drive off in the opposite direction, I saw something. A shadow. Not the man, but something much darker, more sinister. It was moving, crawling along the side of the road, too fast for a person. It was too low to the ground, too unnatural. I hit the brakes again, but it was too late. The shadow lunged toward me, something fast and heavy slamming into the front of the truck. I felt the force of it rattle the entire rig, and the truck rocked violently. The headlights flickered, casting wild shadows across the road, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the outline of a figure, a twisted, elongated form, crawling across the pavement, its limbs bending at impossible angles. The fog seemed to swallow it up again, vanishing into the mist just as quickly as it had appeared. I was paralyzed with fear. My heart was racing, my mind scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there in the truck, staring into the fog, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard the voice again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the road. It came from inside the cab. Turn around. I whipped my head around, scanning the empty seats behind me. The truck was empty. There was no one there. But the voice was unmistakable. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. The air inside the truck grew cold again, so cold that I could see my breath misting up in front of me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. Whatever was in the fog, whatever was watching me, I couldn't stick around to find out. I threw the truck into gear and sped off down the highway, my foot pressing the accelerator harder than I ever had before. The fog seemed to part in front of me as I drove, the darkness shifting to reveal the empty road ahead. As I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror. And in the distance behind me, I thought I saw the faint outline of something moving. A shadow, a figure. I couldn't be sure, but it was there, keeping pace with me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. The fog had lifted by then, and the road ahead was clear. I parked at a gas station, my hands still trembling as I stepped out of the truck. The air was warmer here, the oppressive feeling lifting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? They'd think I was just a tired trucker, hallucinating from too much time on the road. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know one thing for sure, I'll never drive that stretch of highway again.
Next story.
I've been driving trucks for over 10 years. Long hauls, short hauls, all kinds of roads. But nothing in my experience prepared me for that night, the night that's stuck in my mind ever since. I used to think ghost stories were just that, stories. That was until I drove through that damn stretch of highway. It was a cool fall evening, the kind where you can see your breath in the air, but it's still comfortable enough to roll the windows down. I was cruising through Wyoming, heading toward Cheyenne. It was just me, my rig, and the open road. No one else in sight, not another car for miles. The stars were bright in the sky, and the truck's engine hummed as I leaned back in my seat, just taking in the solitude of it all. But there's something about the middle of nowhere in the vast emptiness of the plains that feels off. You don't notice it right away. It's subtle at first, like a nagging feeling in the back of your mind. The wind picks up, you hear something strange on the radio, and then there's that sudden chill in the air. You start looking over your shoulder, wondering if someone's watching, and then you see it. I was about halfway to my destination when I noticed the old gas station on the side of the road. It was a rundown place, with flickering lights and a sign that barely hung on. The kind of place you'd never stop at, especially at night. It looked abandoned, but there was a car parked out front, its headlights dim and barely visible in the dark. My curiosity got the best of me. Maybe they were open for a late-night fill-up, and I could grab a coffee. So I pulled off the highway and parked next to the car. When I stepped out of the truck, I noticed the place was quiet, way too quiet. Not a sound except for the wind. I walked up to the door, but it was locked. A handwritten sign on the window read, "Closed for repairs." Yet the car outside looked like it had been there for hours. I knocked on the door, but no answer. I wasn't about to give up that easily, so I tried the door handle. It turned, and to my surprise, the door opened. I stepped inside. The air was stale and smelled like something had been rotting for years. The light from the dying bulb overhead flickered. I could barely make out the shelves filled with dusty cans and bags of chips, none of which seemed like anything anyone would want to buy. The place was a ghost town, and not just in the literal sense. It felt wrong. I could feel it in my bones. Behind the counter, there was an old man. He was hunched over, wearing a faded red cap and an old plaid shirt. He didn't seem to notice me at first. His hands shook as he fiddled with something in front of him, couldn't tell what it was. His eyes were glued to the object, his face expressionless. "Hey there," I said, my voice sounding way too loud in the silence. The man didn't respond at first. When he finally looked up at me, I saw that his eyes were wide, his pupils black as night, and for a second, just a second, I thought I saw something in his eyes, something that wasn't human. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered, his voice shaky but unnervingly clear. "Excuse me?" I said, stepping back a little. Something in my gut was telling me to leave. "You should have kept driving," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Then his gaze locked onto mine, and it felt like he was peering into my very soul. "She'll get you too." I didn't know what he meant. I didn't want to know. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what was going on. Who was he talking about? Who was she? Before I could ask any more questions, the door to the back room creaked open. I turned, expecting to see a worker or maybe another customer, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It was her. The woman from the corner of my eye earlier. She was tall, unnaturally tall, with long dark hair that hung past her shoulders. Her clothes were tattered, almost like she had been wandering for days. She had a haunting, almost vacant expression on her face, but her eyes, those eyes, were wide open and staring right at me. It wasn't just the look of someone lost in thought. It was something worse. The moment she stepped out from the shadows of the back room, the temperature in the gas station dropped. I could see my breath in the air, and a coldness settled in my chest. The man behind the counter didn't move. He just stared at her, his eyes wide like he had seen this before, but had no control over it. "Get out of here," the old man finally whispered, almost pleading. "She doesn't let go, not once she's found you." I didn't ask who she was. My feet moved before my brain could register what was happening. I turned and bolted for the door, heart racing. But before I could reach the exit, I heard it. A soft whisper. It was low, almost like a murmur, but it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. It wasn't words, just a noise. A sickening sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. I glanced back, and I saw her again, this time closer. Her eyes were locked onto me, and her mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile. But it wasn't a smile of joy or laughter. It was something far darker. The woman was no longer walking. She was gliding toward me, her feet barely touching the ground. I shoved the door open, and as I stepped outside, I heard her voice, cold and hollow. "You can't leave." I didn't look back. I didn't even stop to breathe. I jumped into my truck, slammed the door, and threw it into gear. The truck roared to life, and I floored the accelerator, speeding away from that gas station as fast as I could. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing there, watching me. But there was nothing. Just the empty, desolate highway behind me. I didn't stop until I reached Cheyenne. I don't know what happened at that gas station, but I never went back. I couldn't. It's been 2 weeks since that night, and I've heard rumors about that place. People say that it's been abandoned for years, that the gas station has been closed for as long as anyone can remember. But the locals swear that sometimes, if you drive down that stretch of highway at the right hour, you'll see it. The old man, the car, the woman. Some say she's looking for someone to take her place. Others say she's looking for a soul to drag back to the dark. Either way, I'm not going back to find out.
Next story.
I've been on the road long enough to see and hear things I can't explain. But what happened that night on Highway 71, just outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, I still can't shake. To this day, I wonder if I was just a victim of exhaustion or if I truly saw something I wasn't supposed to see. It was late. Around 2 a.m., I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy from the long haul and the soft hum of the truck's engine keeping me barely awake. The road was empty, just the occasional flicker of a streetlight in the distance and the endless stretch of dark highway. I just passed a small town and figured I'd pull over at the next rest stop to stretch my legs, grab some coffee, and maybe get a little sleep before finishing my delivery in the morning. The truck stop was isolated, one of those places where it felt like time didn't quite move, the kind of place you'd find out in the middle of nowhere. I parked in front of the old, faded diner and turned off the engine, leaving the headlights on as I stepped out of the truck. The air was damp, and a fog had started rolling in from the trees that lined the highway. I could barely make out the outline of the building as I approached. The neon sign above the diner flickered, casting a sickly red glow over the place, and the door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. The low hum of an old jukebox in the corner was the only noise breaking the stillness. A couple of truckers sat at the counter, nursing mugs of coffee and not saying a word. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and graying hair, looked up as I walked in. "Coffee?" she asked, almost mechanically. "Yeah, sure," I said, sliding into one of the empty booths by the window. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I chalked it up to fatigue. She poured my coffee and slid it across the table without a word. I nodded my thanks and took a sip. The liquid was lukewarm, but the caffeine hit me, clearing the fog in my mind for a moment. I looked around the diner. It felt like no one in there really belonged. The truckers didn't look like they'd ever leave. And the waitress, she had this air about her, like she had seen things she shouldn't have. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I caught a glimpse of something outside the window, a figure moving in the fog. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but I could have sworn I saw a man standing near the gas pumps, just outside. He was tall, dressed in a long coat, and his face was hidden beneath a dark hat. He stood there, staring at the diner, unmoving. I turned my attention back to my coffee, trying to brush it off. Maybe he was just another hitchhiker, or someone from the nearby woods. But when I glanced out the window again, he was still there. His face was still hidden, but his presence was unsettling. My nerves started to tingle. There was something about the way he stood there, like he was waiting for something. I tried not to look, but I couldn't help it. I found myself staring out the window, unable to tear my gaze away from him. The waitress must have noticed because she leaned over the counter and gave me a strange, almost sympathetic look. "You seen him too, huh?" she asked in a low voice. I froze. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out the window herself, her expression darkening. "He's been out there for hours, always around this time. Never comes in, though. Just watches." My heart skipped a beat. "Who is he?" "Don't know," she replied, shaking her head. "But they say he's been here for years. Some say he died in an accident on the road. Others say he's a ghost, trapped between here and wherever he came from." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "A ghost?" She nodded. "Ain't no ordinary man. He's been haunting this place for as long as I've worked here. Seen him many times, never spoken a word, just stands out there, waiting." I didn't know what to say. The thought of some kind of spirit hanging around was enough to make the blood run cold in my veins. But something told me this wasn't just some tall tale. The air in the diner had changed, felt heavier somehow. Even the truckers at the counter were avoiding eye contact, their gazes fixed on their mugs, not daring to look up. I stood up, my legs unsteady. "I think I'll get going," I said, my voice tight. But as I reached for the door, something strange happened. The lights above flickered again, and a gust of cold wind rushed into the diner as the door swung open. It wasn't the kind of wind that should have been coming from inside. It was like the fog outside had poured into the room, swirling around my feet. The diner seemed to dim for a moment, and when the lights flickered back on, the man in the coat was no longer standing outside by the pumps. He was standing at the door. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. He hadn't moved, not a step. 1 second, he was outside. The next, he was right there in front of me, standing perfectly still in the doorway. His face remained hidden beneath his hat, but his presence was suffocating, like he was somehow drawing the life out of the room. The waitress gasped softly, her hand trembling as she reached for a napkin to wipe her forehead. The truckers at the counter didn't even look up. And then, as if on cue, the man turned. Slowly. He walked toward the back of the diner, his footsteps almost soundless on the floor. He didn't even look at me. He didn't look at anyone, just walked straight toward the back exit, disappearing into the night. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest. Was he real? Was I losing my mind? Without a word, I walked out of the diner. I couldn't stay there. I didn't want to be anywhere near that man, if that's even what he was. As I climbed back into my truck, I noticed the fog had thickened even more, and I could barely see the outline of the diner through my windshield. I pulled out onto the highway, my hands shaking on the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see him standing there watching me drive away. But there was nothing, only the empty, foggy road behind me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, still watching, waiting for the next driver to come along.
Next story.
I had been a trucker for over a decade, but what happened that night on Route 66, it still haunts me. There's not a day that goes by where I don't wonder if I really saw it, or if I'm just losing my mind from years on the road. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't just the fatigue talking. It started with the usual. Long hours behind the wheel, driving through the night. I was hauling a load of electronics, heading west toward Santa Monica. It was about 3 a.m. when I pulled off the highway for a quick break at a truck stop just outside a little town. There wasn't much to it. Just a few trucks parked and a small diner where a couple of other drivers were drinking coffee, swapping stories. I'd been on the road for 15 hours and felt like I was about to fall asleep sitting up, but I knew I had to keep going. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the truck. The night air was cool, crisp, the kind of quiet that comes only when you're in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless desert. Not a single sound, except for the soft rustling of the wind and the occasional truck passing by on the highway. But something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. It was as if the world had stopped. I walked over to the diner, opened the door, and it was like stepping into another world. The lights flickered a little, and a low hum from the fridge in the corner barely cut through the silence inside. Behind the counter, an old man in a greasy apron was wiping down the counter. His face was pale, with thin gray hair sticking out from beneath a worn-out cap. He didn't look up when I walked in, just kept cleaning the counter, almost like he didn't notice me. "Coffee?" I asked, just trying to break the silence. He nodded without a word. His hands didn't shake or waver, just steady, deliberate movements. Something about it unnerved me, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. I sat down at the counter, trying to feeling of unease. The quiet was unnerving. No radio in the background, no chatter from the other drivers, nothing but the hum of the fridge and the occasional scrape of the old man's rag against the counter. "Long night?" he finally asked, his voice gravely. I nodded, rubbing my face. "Yeah, just another long haul. Haven't stopped in hours." He nodded slowly, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flash across his face. Something. Almost like regret, or maybe fear. But he said nothing else, just handed me my coffee. I was about to take a sip when the door to the diner opened. A man walked in, wearing a long black coat. His face was obscured by the collar, and he moved like someone who wasn't quite alive, or maybe someone who had been dead for a while. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and the door didn't even fully close behind him. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know why, but I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The man didn't look at anyone as he walked to the back of the diner and sat at a booth by the window, his coat trailing behind him like it was alive, swaying gently even though there was no breeze. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help it. Something was wrong about him. He seemed off. The old man behind the counter didn't acknowledge the new arrival. In fact, he had gone silent again, his back turned as he wiped the same spot on the counter over and over. I took a sip of my coffee, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I noticed the reflection in the diner window. The man in the black coat was gone. I looked around. He wasn't at the booth. He wasn't anywhere in the diner. But the reflection in the window didn't lie. He was still there, standing right behind me, close enough that I could feel his presence without even having to look at him. I dropped my coffee, the cup shattering on the floor, but I didn't care. My body moved on its own. My hands trembling, I turned around, heart racing. But there was nothing. Nothing but the empty booth by the window and the reflection of the empty diner in the glass. The door had swung shut behind him, and the bell above it didn't make a sound. I blinked. My head was spinning. Was I imagining this? Everything okay? The old man's voice broke through the fog in my mind. I nodded, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't speak. There was no way to explain what had just happened. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. I grabbed my jacket, paid the old man for the coffee, who didn't even ask if I was okay, and stumbled out of the diner. The air outside hit me like a slap. It was cold, and the silence outside seemed deeper somehow, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I didn't even think. I just climbed back into my truck, started the engine, and pulled away, not daring to look back at the diner. But as I merged back onto Route 66, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. The man, standing in the middle of the road, just outside the diner, his black coat billowing around him like it was caught in some invisible wind. I slammed on the brakes. The truck came to a screeching halt, tires spinning on the asphalt. I blinked. The figure was gone. I don't know what it was, whether it was real or if it was a figment of my exhausted mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I drove the rest of the night with my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting him to appear again, but nothing. The road was empty. The night was still. But even now, when I close my eyes, I still see that man in the black coat. And every time I drive through that stretch of Route 66, I can't shake the feeling that he's out there, waiting.